My name is Claire Whitfield. I am 36 years old, and my family believes I run a small logistics consulting business that barely covers my mortgage. They do not know I own Holloway Capital Group, a $4.3 billion private holding company that controls warehousing, cold chain freight, and mid-market lending across 11 states. I kept it private because in my family, success was not something you earned. It was something assigned. My younger sister, Nicole, was assigned success from birth. I was assigned to be reasonable, humble, and quiet. 3 weeks after my father's funeral, my mother called to schedule the reading of his will. She said it would be simple, since Dad had already made his intentions clear. Years ago, I knew what that meant before I sat down. I attended anyway, because he wanted to see, one final time, exactly how far they would go. Before I tell you what was inside the second envelope, tell me where you're watching from, and whether you've ever sat in a room and let people underestimate you on purpose. I wore an old coat, drove my 10-year-old sedan, and carried nothing but a folder of tissues and a pen, because I wanted them to see exactly the version of me they'd already decided I was. The law office was on the 9th floor of a mid-rise downtown, chosen by my mother because, in her words, it looked appropriately serious. 14 chairs had been arranged around a long table. My mother, Diane Whitfield, sat at the head with a folder already open in front of her. Though the attorney hadn't arrived yet, my sister Nicole sat beside her husband, Marcus Reyes, who had flown in the night before from Chicago, where he worked as a regional director for a mid-sized insurance firm. Nicole wore a black dress that had clearly been altered for the occasion, and a new watch Marcus had apparently given her to mark a new chapter. My uncle Paul Whitfield and his wife Renata sat near the window. My grandmother Evelyn Whitfield sat closest to the door, both hands folded over a cane, saying nothing, watching everyone the way she always did. Before the attorney arrived, Nicole leaned over and told me, gently, that whatever happened today, she hoped I wouldn't feel bad. Dad just believed in structure, she said. He always said money should go where it would actually be used well. My mother added that she had already spoken to a realtor about the lake house, just in case, and that Marcus had generously offered to help manage anything that came to Nicole, since he understood finance. Nobody asked what I understood. Attorney Daniel Osei arrived at 9 sharp, apologized for the delay, and opened a leather folder. He read the preliminary items first. The house going to my mother, the car to Nicole, a modest sum to my Uncle Paul in recognition of decades of loyalty. Then he reached the primary trust distribution. My father's remaining assets, approximately $2.1 million, along with a 40% ownership stake in Whitfield Properties, a small regional real estate holding company, would be divided entirely between Nicole and my mother. My name did not appear. My mother did not look at me. Nicole reached for a tissue she didn't need. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, as though comforting someone who'd just lost, rather than gained, everything. Attorney Osei paused, cleared his throat, and said there was an additional item, a sealed instruction. Your father asked me to read only after the primary distribution was acknowledged by everyone present. My mother said that wasn't necessary. Osei said it was a condition of the will, not a suggestion. He opened the second envelope. Before I tell you what it said, let me back up, because none of this began at the reading. It began 4 years earlier, the year I quietly founded Holloway Capital after buying out a struggling regional warehouse operator with money I'd saved and borrowed against nothing but my own judgment. I never told my family because every early success I'd ever had became a source of suspicion rather than pride. When I got my first promotion at 26, my mother asked whether I'd slept with someone to get it. When I bought a modest condo at 29, Nicole asked whether I was in debt to afford it. I learned that in my family, visible success invited an audit, not applause. So when Holloway grew from one warehouse to a regional network, then into cold chain logistics, then into commercial lending for smaller freight companies that couldn't get traditional bank credit, I told no one. Not my mother, not Nicole, not even my father, though I suspect, by the end, he'd guessed more than he let on. My father, Walter Whitfield, had been a quiet, careful man, a retired civil engineer who rarely offered opinions about money. But 6 months before he died, he asked me, almost offhand, whether I ever regretted staying so small. I told him I was doing fine. He said, "Fine looks different on you than it used to." I didn't understand what he meant until the second envelope. Attorney Osei read the sealed letter aloud. It was addressed to the entire family, not just to me, to whoever is in this room. I have watched, for the better part of a decade, how this family treats success unequally, depending on who displays it and who conceals it. I suspect one of my daughters has built something the rest of you know nothing about, and I suspect the rest of you have spent that same decade deciding, without evidence, who deserves more. My mother's face changed color. Nicole looked at me for the first time since their editing began. The letter continued. I am not dividing my estate today. I am dividing it in 6 months, based on a single condition. Each of you will disclose, honestly and in full, your actual financial situation to Attorney Osei, under oath, in writing. Whoever has misrepresented themselves, to me or to each other, forfeits their share. I loved all of you. I am tired of watching you perform for one another. My mother said this was absurd, that Walter would never have done something so theatrical. Attorney Osei said the instruction had been notarized 14 months earlier, and that my father had specifically asked him to observe the room's reaction before revealing anything. Further, Nicole asked what would happen if someone had nothing to disclose. Osei said the process would simply confirm what was already believed to be true. My mother turned to me and said, gently, the way people speak to someone they believe is fragile, that I shouldn't feel pressured, since everyone already knew my situation was modest. I said nothing. I had 6 months to decide whether to let them keep believing that. I chose to let them keep believing it for a while longer, because I wanted to see what they would do with 6 months, and the belief that money was finally, formally, up for negotiation. It did not take long. Within 3 weeks, Nicole invited me to lunch and mentioned almost in passing that Marcus had found a financial advisor who could help me get my paperwork in order, since the disclosure process could be intimidating for someone without much to report. She said it kindly. She believed it was kindness. A week later, my mother called to say she'd spoken to a mortgage broker who specialized in helping people with limited assets refinance, in case I needed help before the disclosure deadline. She said Marcus had recommended him personally. I asked why Marcus was so involved in my finances. She said, he's family now, and he understands these things better than we do. I asked what things. She said, numbers. 2 weeks after that, Nicole sent me a document. It was a voluntary financial disclosure template, pre-filled with placeholder figures, a modest salary, no investments, minimal savings. She said it would make the process faster if I simply confirmed the numbers were roughly accurate. I did not confirm them. I said I would submit my own documentation to Attorney Osei directly, as instructed. Nicole said that seemed unnecessarily complicated for someone in my position. I asked what position she thought I was in. She said, you know, the usual one. At a family dinner, 5 weeks before the disclosure deadline, Marcus brought up this subject directly. He said that once the estate was finalized, he and Nicole had been discussing whether they could offer me a position, part-time, doing administrative work for a property management arm. He was helping Nicole set up with her share of the inheritance. The salary he mentioned was $38,000 a year. He said it kindly. The way you offer a favor to someone you've already decided cannot refuse one. My mother said this was a wonderful opportunity. Since I'd always struggled to find direction, my Uncle Paul agreed that structure might finally help me settle down. My grandmother, Evelyn, said nothing, but I noticed she had stopped eating. I asked Marcus what the job would involve. He said scheduling, invoicing, coordinating contractors, and occasionally managing correspondence for Nicole, since she'd be the one making the real decisions. I asked whether the position came with any ownership stake, since I would presumably be helping build the business. Marcus laughed, not unkindly, and said, "It's not really that kind of role." I said I would think about it. Nicole said there wasn't much to think about, since I didn't currently have anything better going on. 3 days later, I overheard something I was not meant to hear. I had stopped by my mother's house to return a serving dish from the dinner. The back door was unlocked. I heard Nicole's voice from the kitchen, on speakerphone, talking to Marcus. She was discussing Whitfield Properties, the small real estate holding company she was set to inherit 40% of. Alongside my mother, she said the current occupancy figures they'd need to show OSE, and eventually a lender, were lower than what they'd told my father when he was alive, and lower still than what they'd need to show if they wanted to refinance the 2 commercial buildings the company owned. Marcus told her not to worry, that he'd adjust the reporting before the disclosure deadline. Since OSE was only checking personal finances, not company books, Nicole said she was worried her father's old accountant might notice the discrepancy if he ever reviewed the filings again. Marcus said the accountant had already been replaced, quietly 2 months ago. I did not confront them. I set the serving dish on the counter, left, and drove to the small private office I used for matters I did not conduct from Holloway's headquarters. That night, I opened a secure file I had been keeping for 11 months. Since the month, my father asked me whether I regretted staying small. He had, in fact, guessed. 6 weeks before he died, he'd sent me an email, not asking outright, but attaching a public news article about Holloway Capital's acquisition of a mid-Atlantic freight network, with a single line, "This looks like careful work. Careful people rarely announce themselves." I never replied. I saved it. He had also, separately, retained a forensic accountant, 6 months before his death, to review Whitfield Properties books, after noticing inconsistencies in the company's distributions to shareholders. I learned this only because the accountant, a woman named Priya Anand, had continued the engagement quietly after my father passed, believing the review remained active until formally closed. Priya's preliminary findings, sent to my father 2 weeks before he died, indicated that Whitfield Properties had reported occupancy and rental income to my father, and to at least one lender, that did not match the property management software's internal records. The gap suggested the company had been overstating income by roughly 18% for at least 3 years. I called Priya the next morning. I told her who I was, and that I wanted the full review completed, properly, under engagement with my father's estate, since I was a named beneficiary of the will's disclosure process. Whether or not I received a share, she agreed. It took her 11 days to finish the report. 4 weeks before the disclosure deadline, my mother called again, this time with an edge in her voice. She said Nicole had mentioned I still hadn't submitted anything to Marcus for review, and asked whether I was trying to make things difficult. I told her I would submit everything directly to Attorney OSE, exactly as my father had instructed, and that Marcus's review was never part of the will's condition. My mother said, "Marcus is only trying to help you look presentable." I asked her what would happen if I turned out not to need help looking presentable. She laughed. The short, dismissive laugh she'd used my entire life, and said, "Claire, let's not pretend." I did not pretend for much longer. 2 weeks before the deadline, Attorney Osei called me privately. He said my father had left him one additional instruction, sealed separately, to be opened only if a personally requested it before the 6-month disclosure period ended. I requested it. It was a letter, handwritten, dated 8 months before my father died. "Claire, I don't know everything, but I know enough. I know you built something you didn't want this family to touch, and I understand exactly why. I am not asking you to reveal it to them. I am asking you to decide, when the time comes, whether this family deserves the version of you they assume exists, or the version you actually became. I trust you to know the difference. I always did. I sat with that letter for a long time before I decided anything. 1 week before the disclosure deadline, I submitted 3 documents to Attorney Osei. The first was my own sworn financial disclosure, confirming my ownership of Holloway Capital Group, its approximate valuation of $4.3 billion, and my full personal net worth. The second was Priya Anand's completed forensic report on Whitfield properties, detailing the understated occupancy figures, the altered rental income reports, and their placement of the original accountant 2 months after my father's death. The third was a formal notice that, as a named party to the estate's disclosure condition, I was requesting the 6-month review period conclude with all findings read aloud, together, in the same room, exactly as my father had specified for the primary distribution. Attorney Osei scheduled the final reading for the following Tuesday, at 9 in the morning, in the same 9th floor office. I arrived in the same coat I'd worn to the first reading. I said nothing to anyone in the elevator. My mother assumed, I think, that my silence meant I had little to disclose. Nicole assumed the same. Marcus, seated beside her in a new suit, assumed he had already won. Attorney Osei began with my mother's disclosure, which matched her known assets, Hemoved to Nicole's, which listed her salary, her joint accounts with Marcus, and her anticipated 40% stake in Whitfield properties, valued in her own filing at approximately $600,000. Then he opened mine. He read my name, my ownership of Holloway Capital Group, and the estimated valuation offer $0.3 billion. He paused, the way people pause when they are certain they misread something, and read it again. My mother did not speak. Nicole's hand went still on the table. Marcus said quietly that there must be some clerical mistake. There was no mistake. Osei confirmed the filing had been independently verified through Holloway's corporate counsel and public regulatory filings. Since a company of that size cannot exist entirely in private without a paper trail for anyone willing to check, my grandmother, Evelyn, who had said almost nothing in either meeting, looked at me and nodded once, as though something she had suspected for years had finally been confirmed. I did not gloat. I asked Osei to continue to the second report. He read Priya Anand's findings on Whitfield properties, the understated rental income, the altered occupancy records, the replaced accountant, and the specific instruction Marcus had given Nicole, recorded in an email Priya had recovered during the forensic review, to adjust the reporting before Osei checks personal finances only. Marcus said the email was private correspondence and inadmissible. Osei said the will's disclosure condition applied to any asset a beneficiary stood to inherit, and Whitfield Properties was explicitly named in the primary distribution. Nicole's 40% stake made the company's true financial condition directly relevant. Nicole turned to Marcus and asked whether he had actually changed the numbers. He said he had only adjusted the presentation. She asked what that meant. He did not answer clearly. My mother said this was a private business matter that had nothing to do with our family's estate. Osei said that under the terms of the will, it had everything to do with it, since the will's condition required full and honest disclosure from anyone receiving assets connected to Whitfield Properties. And Nicole was. I asked one question before Osei moved to the final ruling. I asked whether any of what had happened over the past 6 months, the financial advisor recommendations, the pre-filled disclosure template, the $38,000 position with no ownership stake, would have been offered to me the same way if they had known what I actually owned. Nobody answered. I said, "You didn't need my financial statements to treat me with basic respect. You decided who I was a long time ago, and every offer since then was built on that decision, not on anything I actually told you." Osei read the will's final instruction. Under the disclosure condition, any beneficiary found to have submitted false or materially misleading financial information forfeited their share, which would be redistributed among the remaining honest disclosures. Nicole's 40% stake in Whitfield Properties, tied to a company whose books had been altered under her and Marcus's direction, was forfeited. My mother's portion, having disclosed accurately, remained intact. The forfeited share, along with the $2.1 million originally allocated between Nicole and my mother, would now be redistributed per my father's letter to whichever of my daughters demonstrated that honesty was not conditional on comfort. Osei looked at me, then at my mother, and said the distribution named me as the sole recipient of the forfeited share, not because my father wished to punish Nicole financially, but because his letter specified the money should go to whichever daughter proved she did not need it to prove her worth. I did not ask for the money. I told Osei I would accept the forfeited share only if it were redirected, in full, into a trust for my grandmother's long-term care, since she was the only person in that room who had never asked me to become smaller. Evelyn began to cry, quietly, without covering her face. Marcus stood and said this entire process had been engineered by me from the start, that I had somehow orchestrated the disclosure condition to expose Whitfield Properties. I told him I had not written my father's will. I had simply told the truth when asked, and continued asking questions when something didn't add up. He said I had let his company's inflated numbers stand for months without saying anything, allowing him to keep pursuing a refinancing deal with a regional lender based on false occupancy figures. I told him that was true, and that Priya Anand's report, along with a copy of his email instructing Nicole to alter the presentation, had already been forwarded to the lender's compliance department the previous week, once the forensic findings were finalized, because knowingly allowing a lender to rely on falsified figures was not something I was willing to stay quiet about. Regardless of family, Marcus went pale. Nicole asked whether the lender would cancel the loan. I said that was between Whitfield Properties and the lender's legal team now, and no longer a family matter. The consequences did not wait long. Within 10 days, the regional lender suspended the pending refinancing agreement and opened its own review of Whitfield Properties' financial statements. Within 3 weeks, the lender's fraud unit referred the altered occupancy records to state regulators. Since falsified figures had been used in loan documentation, Marcus was removed from any advisory role connected to Whitfield Properties and placed on unpaid leave from his position at the insurance firm pending the outcome of their regulatory review. Since the firm's compliance policy required disclosure of any active fraud investigation involving an employee, Nicole retained her own attorney. Separate from Marcus, once it became clear the altered records had been created and approved primarily by him, with her aware but not the one directing it, their marriage did not survive the 6 months that followed. My mother called me twice in the following month. The first time, she asked whether I could help make this go away, since it was tearing the family apart. I told her the family had been tearing itself apart for years. This was simply the first time anyone outside the family was watching. The second call, she apologized and said she had only ever wanted to protect Nicole, since Nicole had always needed more support. I asked whether protecting one daughter had required diminishing the other for 30 years. She did not answer that question either. I want to be clear about something, because this part matters more than the reveal. I did not build Holloway Capital to prove anything to my family. I built it because I was good at solving distribution problems other people found boring, and because no one was watching closely enough to tell me I couldn't. The silence I kept about it was not a trap. It became one eventually, but that was never the intention. What the will's disclosure condition actually exposed was not my success. It was the difference between how my family treated conditional honesty that only mattered when it was convenient to check, and unconditional respect, which they had never once extended to me without evidence. 6 months after the final reading, Nicole reached out. She had left Marcus, sold their house, and moved into a smaller apartment near her old job. She said she understood, now, what it felt like to be underestimated by someone who claimed to love her, since Marcus had spent years managing her finances without fully explaining what he was doing with them. I told her I was sorry that happened to her, and I meant it. I also told her that understanding what it felt like did not erase the years she had spent assuming the same about me without asking. She asked whether we could rebuild something. I told her I was open to it, slowly, on the condition that it started with honesty instead of assumption. She agreed. We err still, carefully, in the early stages of that. My mother and I speak occasionally, briefly, without the ease we once pretended to have. I do not know if that will change. I have stopped expecting it to. My grandmother's care trust was fully funded within 2 months. I visit her most weekends. She once told me that she'd known for years that I was building something larger than I let on, because I had the same quiet the men in this family mistake for weakness, and the women in this family mistake for absence. I did not do any of this for revenge. I did it because I was finally asked, formally under oath, to describe who I actually was. And for the first time in my life, I decided to answer honestly instead of small. My family believed my silence meant I had nothing. They were wrong. The silence was never emptiness. It was space I built for myself, on my own terms, that no one else had ever offered me. I did not leave them because I became powerful. I stayed in the room because I finally stopped needing their permission to be exactly who I already was. Thank you for listening and for staying until the end.